kind of pit bull. Like Sibulkova was a little bit like that to me as well.
Obviously, one of the storylines last week was Alex Eala and the massive crowds that she was bringing to Dubai. I think it was perhaps maybe more notable there because that's not a tournament that...
25, it's not like, they had cell phones and everything. It was rough. Then all hell broke loose at the press conference in Forest Hills. That's when I famously said I want to be number one. Little did I know that I would, you just don't realize you're in the middle of...
Some tournaments follow a predictable script. The favorites arrive, the crowds gather around familiar names, and everything plays out more or less as expected. But occasionally something happens that nobody planned for, where the biggest story developing on the grounds has absolutely nothing to do with the top seed or the defending champion, and everyone inside the venue begins sensing it before they can fully put it into words. That is precisely what happened in Stuttgart when a teenage girl from the Philippines entered the tournament almost by chance and walked away as the only story anyone wanted to tell. She was never meant to be the center of attention. She was never even supposed to appear in the draw at all. A withdrawal further up the ladder simply created an unexpected opening, and she stepped through it as a replacement. The kind of entry that earns a single quiet line in the official tournament notes and absolutely nothing beyond that. Nobody highlights that name when studying the bracket. Nobody seriously expects the late replacement to become the moment everyone remembers. But Stuttgart that week had other ideas. Because within just a few days, what should have been an unremarkable and easily forgotten appearance transformed into one of the most widely discussed storylines the sport had produced in years, and almost nobody had seen any of it coming. It began quietly the way these moments tend to, a handful of extra fans drifting toward the practice courts, a slightly larger gathering than normal hovering around a warm-up session that would typically attract almost no one. Then the numbers kept climbing, slowly at first and then all at once, until what had looked like passing curiosity began to resemble something much closer to genuine devotion. Fans were reorganizing their entire days around her practice schedule, arriving at the grounds hours ahead of when the gates would normally fill, just to secure a position along the fence where they could watch her warm up. The moment those whispers reached social media, the story took on a life of its own, spreading far beyond the tournament grounds in ways the organizers had not anticipated and were entirely unprepared to handle. Long lines formed where lines had never existed before. Walkways that were usually easy to move through became congested and difficult to navigate. Matches on the outer courts that would normally be treated as routine early round formalities were suddenly generating the kind of demand usually reserved for showcase courts on the final weekend. A first-round encounter that would have passed without much notice anywhere else began carrying a weight and an anticipation that felt completely out of proportion to where it sat on the draw sheet. And the only explanation anyone could offer was that people simply needed to be present for whatever was about to unfold. Security personnel found themselves managing volumes they had not accounted for in any of their planning. Staff members who typically saved their full focus and energy for the closing stages of the tournament were suddenly being redirected and stretched thin during the very first days. Staff who had expected a straightforward opening week were suddenly buried in logistics problems they had never anticipated. And here is the part that made the whole thing genuinely strange, because this surge of attention was not being driven by a deep title run or a shocking upset over a household name. Not yet anyway. It was being driven entirely by anticipation. People simply wanted to watch her play, to be close to whatever was building, to say they were there when it all began. Even veteran commentators, the kind of voices who had spent years covering every major star the sport had produced, began openly admitting they had never seen quite this level of energy attach itself to a player, still this early in her rise. One broadcaster, only half joking, said the young Filipino star did not even need to win that day because the crowd had already made up their minds about her. Another, laughing, tried to play devil's advocate, arguing that her next opponent simply carried too much firepower and too much experience for someone still finding her footing at this level. But even as he said it, you could hear the hesitation creeping into his own voice, as though he was not fully convinced by his own argument. So what was actually drawing people in? Because it clearly was not hype for the sake of hype. Analysts who spent real time studying her game kept returning to the same details. She is left-handed, and there is something about facing a lefty that disrupts the rhythm of even the most seasoned opponents. With angles that feel unfamiliar and shots arriving from a different plane than players are used to defending against. Her forehand drew plenty of praise, but the coaches and pundits who watched her most closely kept pointing to her backhand as the more dangerous weapon, An aggressive and heavy shot she uses to push opponents backward off the baseline and out of their comfort zone entirely. Combine that with her willingness to take the ball early and dictate points rather than sitting back and waiting for opportunities. And you begin to understand why players across the tour were suddenly discussing her as a genuine threat rather than a passing curiosity. Because talent alone earns a glance. What actually holds people's attention is watching that talent meet real pressure and refuse to give way. And that is exactly what began happening match after match. Every win added another layer to the story. Records and milestones that had gone untouched for years in Philippine tennis history began falling one after another. She was not simply winning matches. She was rewriting what had previously been considered possible for a player from her country competing at this level. And every time she broke through, the celebrations that followed felt far larger than the scoreline alone could account for. In one post-match interview, sitting there catching her breath, she admitted she was completely overwhelmed, saying she was thinking about her parents watching from home and wishing she could call them right away, but having to wait until the cameras stopped rolling. Small moments like that, raw and completely unscripted, did more for her connection with fans than any highlight reel ever could. People did not just want to watch her win. They wanted to feel like they knew her, like they were part of the journey alongside her. And that emotional pull stretched far beyond the arena itself. Family stories began circulating, the kind that make you smile without even trying. Her own mother apparently got so caught up in the excitement of a rival storyline that she casually mentioned wanting to go watch another rising star play on a certain day, completely forgetting in that moment that her own daughter had a match scheduled for the exact same time. When gently reminded that her daughter was the one actually playing that day, she laughed it off and insisted that of course she meant she was coming to watch both. It is a small and very human detail, but it says something important about how normal and grounded the whole whirlwind still felt to the people closest to her, even as the outside world was treating her like the defining story of the entire tournament. And then there was the crowd itself, because this is where things stopped being purely about tennis. Wherever she played, sections of the stadium seemed to transform completely, filled with flags, chants, and an intensity that made neutral courts feel like home turf. Opponents noticed it immediately. Commentators remarked on it constantly. What should have been a routine and emotionally neutral tennis match instead carried the atmosphere of a player performing in front of her own hometown crowd, thousands of miles away from home. For a country that had waited decades for a moment like this, that emotional investment ran far deeper than sport alone. She had become a symbol of representation and possibility, living proof that a pathway existed where for a very long time there had not seemed to be one at all. People who had never followed professional tennis a day in their lives suddenly found themselves checking scores, staying up late to watch matches live, and sending real-time updates to friends and family. Entire communities rallied behind her, not because any marketing campaign directed them to, but because her story genuinely touched something personal. And once that kind of grassroots passion reaches a certain scale, it inevitably raises bigger questions about the sport itself, about whether the pull of one player's fan base could begin influencing how tournaments are scheduled, and whether raw audience demand might eventually carry as much weight as rankings when deciding which matches earn the biggest courts and the most desirable time slots. Online, speculation began swirling, with some fans convinced that certain scheduling decisions were quietly being adjusted based on attendance patterns tied specifically to her matches. To be fair, none of that has been officially confirmed, and it is important not to treat rumor as established fact. But even setting the speculation aside, the conversation itself reveals something meaningful about where the sport may be heading. Tennis, like every major sport, is being reshaped by social media and by global fan communities that can rally around a single player almost overnight, regardless of geography. And her rise appears to sit right at the center of that shift, whether she intended it to or not. There is something almost poetic about the fact that a player who entered the tournament as a late replacement ended up becoming the focal point of a conversation about the sport's entire future. Through all of it, she remained remarkably grounded, reflecting on the moment she became the first woman from her country to defeat a Grand Slam champion and the first in 3.5 decades to beat a top 10 player. When asked what that achievement meant not just for her but for her entire nation, she avoided the rehearsed, polished answer and turned the question back around almost shyly, saying that people should really ask the country itself what it meant. She spoke about how difficult it had been growing up without anyone from her background who had walked that same path before her, without a blueprint to follow, without someone to point to and say that if they could do it, so could she. And now, whether she fully embraces the label or not, she has become exactly that person for the next generation coming up behind her. Even in lighter moments away from the pressure of match points and press conferences, you get a glimpse of why people are drawn to her. When asked which player she leans on emotionally during stressful stretches of a tournament, she lit up talking about a fellow competitor known for her humor. Someone she turns to specifically because she knows a laugh will be waiting exactly when she needs it most. It is a small detail, but it matters, because it shows a young athlete who understands that surviving the mental grind of professional sport requires balance, requires laughter, and requires not treating every single moment so seriously that the pressure becomes suffocating. That self-awareness and maturity appear to be a big part of why so many people, fellow players included, have found themselves genuinely rooting for her. So where does this story go from here? Because if Stuttgart proved anything, it is that we are likely still in the very opening chapters of something far bigger. She has already broken barriers that stood untouched for decades. She has already inspired a wave of fresh attention toward a sport that in her home country had previously existed on the margins. And yet, remarkably, she remains one of the youngest rising figures in the entire sport, which means the expectations attached to her name are only going to grow heavier from here. Every tournament she enters now carries a different weight than it once did. Every match arrives with just a little more anticipation than the one before it. The question is no longer whether she belongs on the biggest stages in the sport, because that debate appears to be settled. The real question now is how far this can actually go. Could she eventually climb to the very top of the rankings? Could she inspire an entirely new wave of players from regions of the world that tennis has historically overlooked? Could her name in a few years sit comfortably alongside the sport's most iconic figures, mentioned in the same breath as legends? Nobody can answer that with certainty right now. And honestly, that uncertainty is a big part of what makes this moment so compelling to watch unfold in real time. What happened in Stuttgart was not a fluke and was not manufactured hype either. It was the visible result of talent, timing, and a genuine emotional connection with fans, all colliding at once in front of an audience that simply could not look away. Whether this becomes the defining chapter of an era or simply the loud, unforgettable beginning of a much longer story, one thing already feels certain. She walked into that tournament as an afterthought, a replacement entry buried in the fine print of the draw, and she walked out as the story everyone was talking about. And if the last few weeks are any indication of what is coming next, the tennis world may have only just turned the very first page of something that is going to be talked about for a very long time.